Salam and a warm welcome to our first lesson. Today we'll be speaking about the term Sufism and how our image of Sufism was historically shaped. In that process, we will also sweep away some of the common misconceptions about Sufism, because I think it's really important to have a clean space as free of prejudices and false images as possible, so that we can begin this journey together. I would like to start with a quote that many contemporary scholars of Sufism like to use when they explain this path. And this quote comes from a Persian Sufi, Ali Bushanji, who lived in the 10th century. Bushanji said, "Today Sufism is a name without a reality, but it used to be a reality without a name." What does this quote tell us? First of all, it's a lamentation about the decline of Sufism as early as in the 10th century. Rumi wasn't even born yet. He was born 200 years later. And that quote also points at a very important distinction, which I already mentioned in the short introduction video. It's the distinction between the reality and the name. Reality as it is, or truth as it is nameless. It cannot be found in any words or definitions. And whatever names we use, they actually lead us always into a distance from that reality, from that truth. And as human beings, we also have the tendency to become very attached to names and forms, so they can actually become obstacles in the way of real understanding. On the other hand, as human beings, we think and we operate through language. So names also are useful pointers towards that one nameless reality. So actually the fact that I'm speaking here about Sufism is already a paradox in itself, because I'm trying to use names for something that is nameless. This distinction between the reality and the name, between the essential teaching and the expressions of Sufism over time and in different cultures, between the interior and the exterior aspects of religion, or we can also say the esoteric and the exoteric aspects of religion. This distinction we'll always come back to this duality, and somehow it's one of the really one of the focal points on this journey. Another quote from a Sufi, this time from the 14th century. His name is Ibn Bakhila, and he was a Shadili sheikh. Ibn Bakhila said, "Anyone who would express his thoughts on Sufism is not a Sufi. And anyone who bears witness to Sufism is not a Sufi. In order to live Sufism, one must be absent from it." It's a little bit like that quote, if you meet the Buddha on your path, kill him. So it's really one way, I think, of the mystics telling us that whatever image we create of reality, of God in our mind, this is not it. I also am reminded of the famous story of the elephant in the room and the blind man coming and touching this elephant. Maybe some of you have heard this story. It's actually an ancient Indian story, which also appears in Rumi's Masnavi. And in that story, the blind men come and they lay their hands on the elephant. And of course, because they've never seen an elephant and they're not able to see, each of these blind men has a different understanding of what that being might be. The first blind man puts his hand on the trunk and says, "This being is like a thick snake." Another one reaches out to the ear and thinks this seems like a kind of a fan. The next one touches the leg and says, "Oh, this reminds me of a tree trunk." A tree trunk. Another one puts the hand on the side and said, "Oh, this must be a wall." Another one touches the tail and says, "This is a rope." And yet another one goes and touches the tusk and feels it is hard and smooth and also sharp. This must be a spear. So Sufism is our elephant, and we are like the blind man, really trying to touch different aspects. And as human beings, we always have that tendency to claim absolute truth based on our subjective, limited understanding. So that's why Sufism always teaches us to adopt an attitude of "I don't know." Or as they say in the Buddhist tradition of mindfulness, cultivating the attitude of a beginner's mind. To understand what Sufism is about, we first need to understand Islam. So where does Islamic Sufism begin? It begins with the revelation of the Quran that started in the year 609, when Muhammad was 40 years old. 40 also being an important number of wisdom and maturity in many spiritual traditions. And Muhammad was the first Sufi. His companions and the community around him was the first Sufi community. Of course, they did not call themselves Sufis at that time because it was not necessary to give any particular name to Islam's interior path, because that interior path was everything that existed. The new faith was then lived in all its fullness because there was the presence of a living spiritual master. And there was a total balance of the outer aspects, the rules of faith, and the inner aspects of faith that pertain to the transformation of the human being, the inside job, let's call it that way. So Muhammad's companions, they are called the Sahaba. Why Sahaba? It comes from suhba, the word for companionship. And the Sahaba had the living example of the Prophet. And when I speak about the living example of the Prophet, I mean, first of all, the character traits and the virtues of Muhammad, which are not really well known in the West because we usually have this image of Muhammad as a warrior and as a man of the sword. And we first really need to learn who this spiritual Muhammad actually was and why he is so important to the Sufis. So we'll be paying quite some attention to the person of Muhammad in our next lessons. After Muhammad's death, what happened, as it is often the case when masters die, there was a gradual movement from the initial unity of the community into multiplicity, into different branches. And of course, with all this also comes a split, sectarianism, and religion becomes institutionalized. So the emphasis is more on the rules, on the names. There are power games, and the teachings are diluted. So in the decades and centuries that followed Muhammad's death, it was necessary to filter out that original essence again. And that is exactly what the Sufis aspire to do. The Sufis started to call themselves Sufis in the 2nd century of Islam, so about 200 years after Muhammad's death. And they were the ones who were trying to represent the heart of Islam and the spiritual essence of Muhammad's teachings. So let's look a little bit at the etymology of the word Sufi. Sufi comes from the word suf, which means wool in Arabic, because the first ascetics of the Sufi path, the first, let's say, retreating mystics, they were wearing woolen garments, very rough woolen garments, as a sign of material poverty and even sometimes to irritate the skin and to somehow transcend the body. So this word Sufi soon came to designate those people, the wearers of wool, so to say. From Suf, you can also derive the word tasawwuf. Tasawwuf, which means Sufism in Arabic, and could be translated as the process of becoming a Sufi. The word Sufi was gradually used for those Muslims who stressed certain teachings and practices of the Quran and the Prophet. Those teachings that are pertaining to the inner dimension of Islam. Now, in the Islamic texts, the word Sufi also has an ambiguous connotation. It's sometimes used in a positive and sometimes used in a negative way. In the positive way, Sufis are those people who aspire towards purifying themselves, towards transcending their egos, and towards attaining ethical perfection on earth. So aspiring to become a Sufi is almost like a didactic, an ethical term. In the negative way, and quite a few poets and Sufis, they have used the word Sufi in a negative way. For example, Hafiz. The word Sufi is used to criticize certain distortions of Islam and excesses and misuse that has happened in so-called Sufi circles. For example, uncontrolled ecstasy, abuse of power, hypocrisy, all those kinds of things that we still know very well nowadays. We also need to remember that many people who claimed the label of being a Sufi did not live up to the ideal of what a Sufi is, but many who lived up to the ideal did not even claim that name or didn't even use the name for themselves. So it's not always easy to tell who is a Sufi and who is not. There are also a few other words that are actually even more common in many Islamic texts. One of them is the word arif. Arif means the one who knows, the knower. And from arif also related, there is another term, irfan. Irfan, which we could translate as knowledge, interior knowledge, or gnosis. Also, Sufis were often called poor men, the poor ones, both in a material way, like possessing little and caring little about worldly possessions, but also in a way of being spiritually poor, meaning being empty, completely empty of desires and of any intellectual concepts, so that you can receive divine inspiration. And the Arabic term for that is faqir, and the Persian one is darvish. So these two terms, they have also found their way into Western languages. We know the term fakir for someone nowadays who's doing strange stuff like sleeping on a nail bed. So here you can see how this term somehow evolved and got turned into a kind of very exotic image. And also the word dervish is the same. When we hear dervish, the word dervish, what comes to mind is mostly the whirling dervishes, which is of course only a very small part of the whole story. So let's look a little bit at the two most common terms for this spiritual path in the English language: Sufism and Islamic mysticism. The word Sufism first came up in the writings of Western scholars. Those scholars were exploring non-Christian religions, and the interest for Islam particularly came out of the context of European conquest and colonialism. The question behind all this was, who are we going to rule, and how can we exploit their weaknesses? This is what the British people tried to understand when they were studying Hinduism. And it was very much the same when Europeans first traveled to the Islamic world and encountered Sufis on their travels. Now, what happened in the Western scholarship is that all these phenomena which they observed on their travels had to be put into some kind of a handy category. And you know, in the English language and in other European languages, there is this way of grouping doctrines and philosophies and social movements into isms. Yeah, so you have socialism, you have consumerism, you have Hinduism, and also you have Sufism. Of course, these are very static categories that can hardly grasp the essence of what those traditions are actually about or what those ideas are about. Hinduism, for example, is a huge array of diverse teachings, and putting it into an ism, of course, is a very artificial way of trying to group all those diverse manifestations. The image of Sufism, as I already said, was very exotic and very highly exoticized, as some kind of a strange sect within Islam. And the most foreign, the most strange expressions of Sufism, or the most placative, let's say, expressions of Sufism, were the ones that received the highest attention among the Europeans. Let me show you a few photos here to show you what I mean. So here you can see an illustration from a book on the dervishes or Oriental spiritualism. This is the title. The book is from the year 1868, and it shows a Naqshbandi sheikh subduing a lion by his spiritual powers. That's the kind of the subtitle of the image. You can imagine what these kinds of drawings, what kind of an image they transported into 19th century Great Britain. Another image, another illustration. Here it says the Howling Dervishes. And the Howling Dervishes were groups of dervishes who practiced a certain kind of dhikr, or invocation of divine names, which could sometimes lead to loud screaming and screams of ecstasy. So they were simply called the Howling Dervishes. And here we have a photo from a newspaper, probably, I would say, the early 20th century. Let me read to you the caption. It says, "Religious frenzy made a tourist show. The whirling dervishes of Constantinople, like the howling dervishes of Egypt, have long been among the prominent tourist attractions. The novice must serve the order at manual labor for 1001 days. And if he fails one day during that time, he must start all over again. He must start all over again." Wow. what a strange thing this is. This must have been, I guess, the reaction. So here we see how gradually this image of Sufism was built in the West. And we also have to critically approach the other term that is frequently used, the term of Islamic mysticism or Islamic spirituality. The word mysticism emerged out of the Protestant world, and it has been applied to all religions. It is very much like the modern concept of religion as some kind of a static phenomenon. Yeah, these are Hindus, these are Muslims, these are Christians, putting everything under one term. In that way, mysticism is also a constructed category. Another issue is that this word mysticism or mystic is a quite vague term. You know, it somehow awakens associations of something strange or magic or something metaphysical that can't be really explained, maybe even something surreal or fantastic. And at the same time, when we speak about mystical experience or religious experience, which is another term that came up in the Christian context, we usually speak about individuals on a quest for experiencing unity or on a quest of meeting God. Whereas in the Sufi context, this quest was often lived in community and in companionship with others. So the word mysticism and mystical experience, so also really doesn't help us that much. René Guénon, who was a very prolific and important scholar in the past century, and also initiated into a Sufi order, and really one of the thinkers of traditional Islam, said that mysticism is also passive. It brings up some image of passivity. You're waiting for some kind of an experience to happen, or maybe one day lightning will strike you from above, and you'll suddenly be illuminated. But if we look at it that way, if we forget that Sufis really had to pay effort on their spiritual path and work towards becoming mature human beings, so that they could reach that kind of illumination. And also they were serving in society. So that was ultimately the ideal, to not retreat in your cell passively, but actively be among the people and serve them. So I think what we can conclude from this discussion is that all these labels are far too broad and also far too narrow to really grasp all the teachings that are connected to Sufism. And as I already said in the introduction, we are speaking about many flavors of Sufism also. We have the Maghrebinian Sufism, the Sufism in Northwest Africa, in countries like Morocco or Algeria, which is also connected to Andalusia. Ibn Arabi, one of the most important Sufi masters of all ages, he was born in today's Spain. Then, of course, if we go further east, we have Egypt, we have the Arab Peninsula, where Islam emerged. And then we have the whole vast realm of Persia and Central Asia, where you find, again, another completely different flavor or completely different expressions of Sufism, very much connected to poetry and to the arts. And moving on to the Indian subcontinent, again, you find a lot of cross-pollination there, especially with the Buddhist and the Hindu traditions. And then we can go as far east as Malaysia and Indonesia, again, where other types of Sufism emerged over time. So something in Sufism essentially defies any kind of definition or categorization. It's as if we are being told, Here is the threshold. If you're not leaving your mind behind and your reasoning behind, then you won't be able to get very far. Now, if we go a layer deeper, we will see that actually there is another underlying problem when we project things on Sufism, which is that our modern way of thinking and our modern way of researching things, especially in the academic world, comes from a worldview that is very different from the worldview in which Sufism has emerged. The worldview of Sufism, some people call that worldview traditional worldview, is a worldview in which God, the sacred, and the quest for meaning are put into the center of everything. All aspects of life, including science, and science was deeply practiced in Islamic civilization, all those aspects are organized and directed towards that quest, towards God. In the West and in all those cultures that have been influenced by Western thinking, or let's call it modern thinking, we have lost our connection to this kind of a worldview. And also there is a tendency towards literalism, both in the West and in the Islamic world, always seeing only the surface of things, only accepting what is perceivable with the senses or what can be proved. This expresses itself, of course, in modern science, but expresses itself also in the literalism of Islamic fundamentalists. Let's say they take the Quran, they read a sentence, they say, this is what it means, and this is how it should be. So in a way, all this is a very modern way of thinking, and fundamentalist scientists and fundamentalist believers of any religion, this is actually where they meet. So let's look at how Sufism is popularly seen today. Sufism now has become one of the categories in New Age spirituality. It's used for all kinds of things. You open your Facebook feed and you get a Sufi poem, or you go to a workshop of whirling and you become a Sufi. You also have festivals for Sufi music, which originally only used to be performed in the context of shrines and intentional Sufi gatherings. So there is a whole popularization of Sufism going on in the past decades. Also, there are people who describe Sufism as the universal spirit of unity in all the religions or in all the spiritual traditions. Of course, that's a very beautiful way to express it, and many Sufis have actually reached this conclusion themselves. But at the same time, there is a problem with this, which is that if you look at it in that way, the connection to Islam becomes coincidental or even an obstacle. Islam becomes or is turned into an obstacle towards real Sufism. And we also have that image of Rumi, for example, leaving Islam behind and discovering that it's no good, and you just have to free yourself of all those unnecessary rules and whirl ecstatically. So this leads us to an important discussion, which is the confusion about how Sufism relates to Islam. This confusion, if we go back again to the topic of Western scholarship, can already be found among the early scholars. They said Sufism is not real Islam, it is something that was added on later and borrowed from other tradition. Now we can easily refute this. It's simply wrong because it's clearly in the Quran and in the sayings of Muhammad, we can find the essence of Sufism, which we'll see in the next two lessons especially. And this kind of attitude also ignores, of course, the importance of the Quran and Prophet Muhammad, of Islamic laws and rituals for all those people which those scholars called Sufis. So where did this idea come from? As I said earlier, Western scholarship of Islam and Sufism emerged from the context of conquest and colonization. So with this mindset of Osro, there was a hostility towards Islam. There was this image of the religion of the sword. It seemed fundamentally alien. And from this perspective, the scholars were saying it's not possible that Islam could have produced the beauty of, let's say, Sufi poetry. So the only way to explain the beauty of Sufi poetry was that those things must have been borrowed from other religions, from the Hindus, from the Buddhists, the Christians, and also from the Greeks. Yes, in fact, there was a vivid exchange between all those traditions in the Middle Ages, but that was much later. So we can't really keep that argument. So speaking of the Middle Ages, for example, in Andalusia, what is now southern Spain, there was a very alive field of philosophical exchange, of exchanging ideas, and the texts of the Sufis found their way into the circles of Andalusian Jews. At the same time, we know that among the Islamic scholars, the Arabic scholars at that time, there was a deep studying of the Greek philosophy. And it was actually the Arabs who helped reintroduce the Greek philosopher to the Europeans. Because from Arabic, it was translated into Latin. And then those works of the old Greek philosophy, they found their way to Europe. And then they actually brought about the Renaissance and this whole turn of mentality that occurred in Europe, a whole development that actually was triggered through this kind of exchange. But as I said, this kind of exchange happened much later. So we can't say that Sufism is kind of something that was copied and pasted. Parallels between the teachings, I would say, much more, they show us that fundamentally there is something about human nature, a basic longing that is the same no matter where human beings live. Of course, also the psychological makeup and the spiritual experiences, they are always the same. So that's why it shouldn't surprise us if similar ideas and similar concepts spring up in different parts of the world. Let's take the example of the concept of nirvana in Buddhism, which we could maybe in a Sufi way translate as extinction of the ego in the divine self. Sufis call it fana. And the Christian mystics, they called it the annihilation of the heart in God. This idea that Sufism has nothing to do with Islam is something we hear nowadays very often, both in the West and in the Islamic world. So let's look at the West first. Many people in the West, they are now familiar, as I already said, with certain Sufi teachings, let's say Sufi poetry or Sufi whirling or Sufi music, but they get very surprised when you speak about the relationship between Sufism and Islam. One of the reasons for this is, of course, the distorted image of Islam existing nowadays, especially in the West, since 9/11. Some people even say that after the fall of the Soviet Union, when communism was not an enemy anymore, there had to be a new enemy that, as a construct, something out there to justify, one's political actions, and that enemy became Islam. So the problem here is the reduction of Islam to its outer appearance, to its outer manifestations. seeing Islam only in the name or in the forms, but not in its essential reality. So, of course, if we look at social and political factors of Islam and what's going on in many countries in the Islamic world, and we take that to be Islam, it's very understandable that prejudice might emerge. Those who are repelled by Islam often know very little about the historical circumstances of how Islam emerged, and of course, almost nothing about the spiritual roots of this tradition. Let's take the example of the Quran. Many people are outraged by certain verses of the Quran. But this, of course, happens because those verses are read completely out of context. So there's no knowledge about how those verses came about, what they actually meant at the time when they were revealed. And those quotes also, they are usually quotes that pertain to war, whereas you hear very little about all those verses which abound in the Quran, which speak about tolerance, generosity, compassion, and self-knowledge. So we'll be looking more into how the Quran is actually meant to be read and understood, because I think this is a really fundamental topic and something where, especially in the West, we are on very slippery grounds. Let's look at what happened in the Islamic world. By the way, the word Islamic world, again, is something that can be criticized because it kind of suggests as if there is like one coherent Islamic world, which is of course not the case, but I'm now using it for the sake of simplicity. In many Islamic countries or Muslim countries, people have lost their understanding of the essence of their own religion. So Islam has become narrowed down to certain external practices. Again, the name, the form. So this happens, first of all, through habitual imitation. So you just copy and paste what you learn, from your parents. And if your parents also didn't practice Islam from its essence or in a spiritual manner, then of course you also won't be doing that. This is called taqlid, or imitation, instead of real exploration, tahqiq, real searching for the truth. So nowadays, in many Muslim countries, there is a significant number of Muslims who belong to some sort of orthodox or dogmatic groups who consider Sufism as separate from Islam, or a distorted kind of in Islam. So let's look a little bit into the reasons for this. This attitude that Sufism has nothing to do with Islam actually emerged since the year 1800. This was the period of the European conquests and European imperialism becoming more and more of a problem for many Muslims. Almost every Muslim country was conquered and colonized. From Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1793 to the colonization of the Maghreb, Northwest Africa, by the French, and then the breakup of the Ottoman Empire in 1920, and then the French and the British coming and dividing up those lands that are now, Syria, Palestine, and all these problems that emerged from there. So Muslims being faced with this Western power and Western conquest, they ask themselves, okay, the West is coming with a very strong ideology. They are coming with nationalism and with imperialism. So what is our ideology that we can put against this force? And they came up with the term Islamism. Or I'm not sure if actually the term Islamism existed back then, but basically what they came up with was a kind of Islamic fundamentalism which turned itself against the moral corruption of the West. And that's still a kind of a narrative that we often observe nowadays in Muslim countries. Fundamentalists both back then, 200 years ago, and still today, they try to monopolize religion for their own ends. They use mass media and propaganda to do so. And sadly, the loudest voices are always those that make it into the media, as we know. So one of their goals is making Sufism into something un-Islamic or anti-Islamic. In fact, the Sufi scholar Karl Ernst, who I'm drawing from here, he writes that before the 19th century, it would not even have been possible to make a statement like Sufism has nothing to do with Islam. Up to the late 18th century, so about 200, 250 years ago, most of the outstanding scholars of Mecca and Medina, so today's Saudi Arabia, they were Sufis. They were intimately engaged with Sufism. Of course, nowadays we have a completely different situation. We have a kingdom in Saudi Arabia with a state ideology that is called Wahhabism, which is strictly hostile to Sufism. So it's an irony that actually the birthplace of Sufism is now that place where Sufism is most in danger, or one of those places, let's say, because there are others as well, sadly. So all this shapes our image of Islam in the West. For most people in the West, including my own country, Germany, this kind of politicized and polarized Islam is all that exists. If you open the newspaper and that's what you are served, those kinds of stories, of course, that's what will shape your image and will shape your view of Islam, especially if you have never come in contact with actual real Muslims. So when I came back from my early travels into Muslim countries, Syria and Iran, I felt almost like a missionary because I was always telling the stories of meeting Muslims, how kindly I was treated, the hospitality and generosity I experienced in those countries, which I couldn't experience back in Germany. And I developed almost this kind of an apologetic narrative, trying to say, you know, Islam is not like that. Islam is not how you think. And that is also what finally somehow drew me into journalism, I would say, to transport really those experiences that I've collected in Muslim countries. What is the result of all this? It is that actually Islamic fundamentalists in the Islamic world, and also modern seekers and modern people who are interested in Sufism in the global spiritual supermarket, they come to the same conclusion. The conclusion being that Sufism has nothing to do with Islam. So what we are trying to do in this course together is really to dig our way through all those layers of polarization, of misuse, to really understand what Sufism is about, what Islam is about. And for that, we first have to reclaim all those concepts and go to the roots of what these words actually mean and what they have meant to the Sufis over the centuries. So I hope this hasn't been too confusing. We've been talking a lot about concepts and ideas. Let me rewind a little bit and tell you a story. It's the story of Abul Hasan al-Kharaqani. This is the little village of Kharaqan. I mean, outside the village, the landscape. And Kharaqan is a small place in the central north of Iran. And it's just a few houses, a grocery store, but one very important tomb of an important Sufi. Abul Hasan al-Kharaqani, he died in the year 1033. And he was one of those Sufis who you could easily call lovers, because he always has a strong emphasis on love and tolerance towards all human beings, no matter what faith they come from. This is me with his statue on my first journey to Kharagon. And this is the entrance to his tomb, beautifully decorated with calligraphy, as well as some floral patterns and geometric designs in the ceiling of the tomb. We'll be actually speaking about Islamic arts, hopefully, towards the end of this course. So Khalaqani, once he was sitting with 40 dervishes. Of course, 40 again, we have that number here. And a stranger knocked the door. You must know that dervishes, they were fasting a lot. And in that particular week, they had no food left. And the stranger coming into their khanqa, or into their community place, was carrying a bag of flour and a sheep. He said, "I have brought this for the Sufis." When the Sheikh, Abul Hasan al-Kharani, heard this, he said, "Let anyone who claims to be a Sufi accept these gifts. As for me, I do not have the audacity to call myself a Sufi and make a mockery of Sufism." And the man, probably confused, departed with his flour and his sheep. Another quote from Kharaqani, where he says, "A true Sufi is he who is not." So according to Kharaqani, being a Sufi is actually more about a state of human perfection that we all aspire to as people on the spiritual path. It's not some kind of a membership to a certain group. So I think that our best chance at really understanding what Sufism is about comes through catching some glimpses of the great Sufis, how they understood Sufism. So let's look at a few more quotes. This one comes from Abu Nasr as-Sarraj. He has a book called the Kitab al-Luma, and he says in it, "The Sufis are people who prefer God to everything, and God prefers them to everything else." Another quote from the famous poet Jami, whose grave is in Herat, today's Afghanistan. "Who surpasses you in good moral qualities surpasses you in Sufism." So here we have a clear connection between morality and right action in the world, service towards humanity, and Sufism. So he's taking that as a definition for what it means to be a Sufi. Rumi, in the Masnavi, the third book, he says, "What is Sufism?" He said, "To find joy in the heart when grief comes." That's a very beautiful definition. I really love that one. Kushairi, another Sufi, says, "Sufism is a state in which all human traces have vanished." Human traces here, of course, meaning the traces of the ego, the traces of that part in us that makes us feel like we are separate from everyone and everything else. Hujwiri, another Sufi from the medieval times, whose grave is located in Lahore, in today's Pakistan, says simply, "Sufism is freedom." So you see how there are different angles, different ways to express Sufism, but it's all pointing towards one reality. Let me add a few more definitions. Sufism is a path of getting closer to God. Sufis stress inwardness over outwardness, as we already said, the esoteric over the exoteric. Sufis strive to see reality as it is, but not through the filters of our ego, our nafs. And Sufism is a path in which knowledge and love both play a major role. In fact, we'll see that knowledge and love, those two paths, actually express the very same truth. And you can find a stronger emphasis on the one or the other in different Sufi traditions and in different Sufi writers. I would like to close with a definition that I really like. It comes from William Chittick, one of the great Sufi scholars of our time, and also someone who knows the tradition really from the inside and lives the Sufi way himself. He calls Sufism the animating spirit of the Islamic tradition. In another place, he says, Sufism is the invisible spiritual presence that animates all authentic expressions of Islam. Wherever the spirit flourishes, Islam is alive to its own spiritual and moral ideas. But to the extent that it, Sufism, languishes, Islam becomes desiccated and sterile if it survives at all. To the extent that Sufism languishes, Islam becomes desiccated and sterile if it survives at all. And we'll be seeing in the next lessons how actually Sufis always strive to live Islam in its essence and strive to enliven their faith through spiritual practice. And here is a Rumi poem to end. Har kuja dardi dava anja ravat. Har kuja faqri nava anja ravat. Har kuja mushkil jawab anja ravat. Har kuja keshti ist ab anja ravat. Ab kamju teshnegi avar be dast. تا بجوشد آب از بالا و پست. Where there is pain, cures will come. Where there is poverty, wealth will follow. Where there are questions, answers will be given. Where there are ships, water will flow. Spend less time seeking water and acquire thirst. Then water will gush from above and below.